The MacBook Air M1 has been the best laptop that I have ever owned. I mean it. I could blurt out everything I love about it, but it would be best if I offer an explanation for each of my points. So my experience with laptops has been shoddy, or was shoddy at least before the MacBook Air M1. My budget was under £500, which meant that some laptops were only short-term before experiencing problems. I only ever kept them in the extreme short term as I got rid of them swiftly due to performance or specs or just the build quality. The screens were always the worst on cheap laptops. The viewing angles were terrible, color reproduction was terrible, and sometimes brightness was pathetic really. A bit of sunlight and that's it, it's gone. Especially now after being spoilt with an iPhone and in an iPad Pro, I just couldn't look at something or pay attention to a screen that only went up to 250 nits, not IPS, and with poor color distribution. I went through this for a while, through a few laptops, until I bought the MacBook Air 2020 during lockdown. Now, it was the dreaded i3 version. Now, I find out that not only the i3 was horribly optimized for macOS, but Apple had placed a noisy fan in a position that basically didn't cool the unit down, didn't suck any air out properly. It was bizarre. This meant that the laptop kept throttling, but I did obviously love the fact that the MacBook Air build quality was fantastic, and the software is pretty much on point. I can't remember the last time I had a crash in macOS. Now, my luck came because I then heard about the M1 chips. I simply thought it was going to be a basic mobile chip from the sounds of it, with a few compatibility issues which we sorted out later on. So I returned the i3 model and got the MacBook Air M1. Now, by the time I got the MacBook Air M1, it had already released and the reviews were just all raving about it. Now, the build quality, as with the i3 version, was amazing. Apple aren't known for radical changes. The bezel was a bit ugly, but I didn't care. I finally had a reliable laptop that was quick, light, and had no fan. I then found out about the M1's capabilities and was blown away to the point where the M1 became my daily driver. The 8GB unified memory was smoothly optimized. The SSD speed was great. I never measured it, but things would load up really quick. I managed to get the M1 a few months after release, as mentioned before, which meant I skipped over some of the initial bugs that people had. The screen, while not as good as an iPhone or an iPad Pro, was amazing, with lovely color reproduction and angle view. Brightness is pretty decent too. There's obviously a bit of fear over the whole screen cracking issue. Lawsuit was opened up against Apple, not sure what's happening to that, but I can thankfully say that my M1 is fine. Although it made me paranoid about taking it even out of the room. It's a lot of money that was spent, even with AppleCare. I just didn't want to see that happen to it. I slowly gained my confidence and began shifting it around the house. But still something was missing from my MacBook Air M1, and that was Steam. Now, I don't have modern games on it. I've got a lot of old classics, childhood classics as well, which I bought later on, and I play and I love accessing them, and I just missed it, and I realized that Steam could be better accessed through a desktop, a Windows desktop or Windows laptop, because of the amount of games available. Even the games that are available on the Mac version of Steam, they're not as optimized. They eat up a lot of the resources, and there are issues. Civilization 6, for example, does have issues with resolution and scaling, and it just doesn't look great. I tried the iPad Pro with a keyboard to have that secure OS, and the OS it's just not up to it. It's still a mobile-based OS. I wanted to multitask like you could on Windows or Mac. I did at one point try to replace my MacBook with an iPad Pro and keyboard, but because of the limitations in the operating system, you just couldn't. I could have apps in Windows open, but not side by side in the respect that you can have it on Windows or Mac. In terms of hard drives, all my existing hard drives are red, as macOS requires them to be in a different format. I wasn't too keen on reformatting an external drive and transferring data every time. So for example, if I set up a hard drive in Windows, but then I connect it to my Mac and tried to save stuff on it wouldn't. And that's because it needs to be done in an exFAT format. Whereas Windows, I used to just do it on the default one. I never bothered checking the format on them. But I found if you set up a drive fresh, either on macOS or connect it straight to the iPad, it should work straight in Windows. So the iPad obviously had a problem with accessing hard drives, external SSDs. At least it wasn't fast enough for me. I ended up deciding to stick my iPad Pro for media consumption purposes only, and my MacBook for video editing purposes. And I only decided that I wanted a Windows device that I could use on the sofa and maybe turn it into a laptop as well, so maybe have it a touchscreen, which is why I went for the Microsoft Surface lineup. So I ended up going for the Surface Pro 7 Plus, which has an 11th Gen i5, 128GB RAM, space, micro SD slot, although they do remove this in the Pro 8 models, which is not great. It's capable of playing my own old Steam titles, which is fantastic, and it's quick and snappy. Oh, and with an alleged 15 hours of battery added to the mix, I should enjoy using this one, although I'm pretty much getting 7 hours out of it, so it's a bit of a lie. And that's provided me with an alternative to the MacBook Air M1. I have to admit, I can't just use the MacBook Air M1 and Mac OS. I have to use Windows as well. I grew up with two operating systems. Well, mainly with Windows. Mac sort of came later on. But I've still encountered some issues with MacBook Air M1, as good a laptop as it is. So using Final Cut Pro with 8GB has proved to be tricky with my larger projects. If I compile a project and I decide to browse around, I noticed that my page file was being accessed way more because the 8GB of unified memory would be completely used up. The performance would dip in this moment slightly. Also, in whizzing along the timeline, the footage doesn't load as quickly. I have to stop on it. Then it appears. It doesn't lag, it just appears a second later. Now, is the MacBook Air M1 for me? Of course it is. It still is for me. I am tempted by the MacBook Air M2, but not by the increase in performance that allegedly it's supposed to have. But in simpler words, it's not going to be that much faster. And, Apple's going to be sensible about that, especially since the MacBook Air M1 outsold the MacBook Pro models when it first came out. So let me know what you think in the comments below, like and subscribe, and until next time.